I never thought of myself as the kind of woman who would stray. My marriage was solid, my husband reliable. We had built a life of quiet stability, comfortable, predictable. And yet I found myself craving something more. Not love, not commitment, just a spark. That breathless anticipation. That feeling of being desired, of being truly seen. That night, I visited my best friend's house, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. Just a quiet evening of wine, laughter, and the kind of easy conversation only years of friendship could bring. But when I walked in, I saw him, her son home from college. He had grown. The last time I saw him, he was just a boy, lanky and awkward. Now he stood with the kind of confidence that only comes with youth. He was taller, broader, sharper. His eyes held an unspoken challenge, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. "Hey," he greeted me, his voice lower than I remembered. I smiled politely, feeling a strange unease settle in my chest. "It's been a while. You look different." He smirked, leaning casually against the kitchen counter. "So do you?" It was nothing. A simple exchange. And yet I felt my skin prickle under his gaze. A slow heat crept up my spine. As the evening went on, I tried to ignore him, focusing on my friend's stories, on the familiar comforts of our friendship. But he was there, always in the corner of my vision. The way he moved, the way he watched me, not in an obvious way but in a way that felt deliberate. Calculated. At one point, as I reached for my glass of wine, our hands brushed. Just a second, a fleeting moment of contact, but my breath hitched. He didn't pull away immediately. Neither did I. Our eyes met. His were dark, steady, unreadable. My stomach clenched, my pulse hammering in my throat. I pulled my hand back, gripping my glass too tightly. This is ridiculous. I am imagining things. And yet, the way he looked at me made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Later that night, as my friend went upstairs to grab something, I found myself alone with him. The air in the room shifted, thick with something unspoken. "You seem distracted," he said, tilting his head slightly, studying me. I let out a soft laugh, trying to mask my discomfort. "Long day, that's all." He stepped closer, just enough for me to catch the scent of his cologne, fresh, with a hint of something darker underneath. "Is that really it?" he asked, voice low. Something about the way he said it made my skin tingle. "You shouldn't talk like that," I murmured, glancing toward the staircase, hoping my friend would return any second. "Why not?" His lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. I swallowed hard. I should have walked away. I should have shut this down. But I didn't. Because for the first time in years I felt like I wasn't invisible. And that was dangerous. I told myself it was nothing. A fleeting moment, a trick of the mind. Maybe I had misinterpreted his stare, his smirk, the way his fingers lingered a second too long against mine. I repeated this to myself all the way home. I convinced myself again as I curled up beside my husband in bed, his familiar scent wrapping around me. Safe, comfortable, predictable. And yet, as I lay in the darkness, my mind wandered, back to the way he had looked at me, the slight curve of his lips, the confidence in his voice. It had been a long time since someone had looked at me like that. A few days passed before I saw him again. It was at a cafe near my office. Completely unplanned, completely coincidental. Or so I thought. I had just ordered my usual when a voice behind me made my stomach tighten. "Black coffee, right? No sugar." I turned. Him. He stood too close. Not inappropriate, just enough to make my pulse quicken. "You remembered," I said, forcing a lightness into my tone. "Of course." His eyes gleamed with something I couldn't place. I noticed things. Something in the way he said it made my breath hitch. He leaned in slightly, just enough for only me to hear. "Like the way you looked at me the other night." A rush of heat shot through me, my heart slamming against my ribs. I swallowed hard. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" I should have walked away right then. Ended it. But instead I hesitated, just long enough for him to know he had struck a nerve. We sat across from each other at a small corner table. I told myself it was harmless. Just coffee. Just small talk. But it wasn't. He studied me like he was peeling back layers, searching for something beneath the surface. "So, how's married life?" he asked casually, but there was something sharp beneath his words. "Good," I answered automatically. "Stable. Easy." He smirked, fingers drumming against the table. "Easy sounds boring." I tensed. "It's not." But even as I said it, something inside me twisted. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. You don't look convinced. I exhaled slowly. You're playing a dangerous game. His smile deepened, lazy and confident. Maybe. But you're still sitting here. I should have left. I should have told him to stop. But I didn't. As I grabbed my purse to leave, he reached out, not to grab me, just to let his fingers barely brush mine. A feather-light touch, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. And then, before I could process what was happening, he kissed me. It wasn't a deep kiss, not urgent or desperate. It was slow, deliberate, a test. And I didn't pull away. Not at first. When I finally did, my breath was uneven, my fingers trembling. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. What the hell are you doing? I whispered. He tilted his head, studying me. I think the real question is, what are you doing? I had no answer. I turned and left, my heart hammering, my lips still tingling where his had been. And yet, deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. I should have felt guilt. I should have felt shame. But all I felt was the rush of something I hadn't felt in years. What? I spent the next few days convincing myself that it hadn't meant anything. That the kiss was a mistake. That I wasn't that woman. The kind who entertained forbidden thoughts, who let a fleeting moment threaten the stability of everything she had built. And yet, every time I was alone, I replayed it. The way his lips pressed against mine, slow, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. The way my body responded before my mind had the chance to catch up. The way he had looked at me afterward, so damn sure of himself. I wanted to forget it. But I couldn't. I avoided my friend. I ignored his texts, because of course he had my number now. I convinced myself that if I didn't see him, it would all just fade. But fate, or whatever cruel force controlled this game, had other plans. It was my friend's birthday. I had no excuse not to go. My husband and I arrived at her house together, hand in hand, a picture-perfect couple. But the second I stepped inside and saw him, leaning casually against the kitchen counter, my stomach twisted. I had spent days trying to forget. And in an instant it all came rushing back. Our eyes met. He smirked, just a slight tilt of his lips, but it was enough. He knew. He knew I was thinking about it. That I hadn't let it go. And suddenly the air in the room felt too thick, too hot. I spent the night avoiding his gaze, pretending I wasn't hyper-aware of his every move. I laughed at my husband's jokes, drank my wine too quickly, and made polite conversation with guests. But then, as I moved toward the hallway leading to the bathroom, a hand wrapped around my wrist. I sucked in a sharp breath. Him. Are you ignoring me? His voice was low, edged with amusement. I glanced toward the party, making sure no one was watching. Let go. He didn't. Not yet. His grip wasn't tight, just firm enough to remind me of the tension humming between us. I've been thinking about you, he murmured. Don't, I whispered. He tilted his head. Then why are you shaking? I yanked my wrist free, but I didn't move. And that was my first mistake. He took a step closer, not enough to touch, but enough that I could feel the heat of his body. You don't want me to stop. I let out a sharp breath. You don't know what I want. His gaze dropped briefly to my lips before meeting my eyes again. Then tell me. Right now. Tell me you don't want me. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Because I couldn't. Because it would be a lie. Suddenly, footsteps echoed down the hallway. I stepped back just in time as my friend appeared. There you are. We're cutting the cake. I forced a smile, my pulse still hammering. I'll be right there. Her son didn't move at first. He held my gaze for just a second longer. A silent promise, a challenge I wasn't ready to face. Then with that damn smirk he turned and walked away. I should have been relieved. Instead, as I followed my friend back to the party, all I could think about was what almost happened. And how much I wanted it to. I told myself that night was the final warning. That I had been lucky, too close, too reckless. I convinced myself that I could still stop this. That whatever was growing between us could be buried before it became something unstoppable. I threw myself into routine. Woke up early. Made breakfast. Kissed my husband before he left for work. Went to yoga, went shopping, kept myself busy with things that made me feel normal. And yet he was there. Always. Not physically, but in my thoughts, lingering like the taste of something forbidden. Every time I closed my eyes I saw his stare, heard his words. I should have known that running wouldn't work. A week later I found myself alone in my car outside the house where it all started. My friend had invited me over for lunch, and I had accepted before I knew what I was doing, before I had thought it through. And now I was here. I wasn't sure if I was hoping he would be there, or hoping he wouldn't. When I stepped inside, my friend greeted me with a warm hug, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. She was in the middle of setting the table, chatting about something from work, and I let myself fall into the comfort of her voice, into the illusion of safety. But then I heard footsteps. And the second he walked into the room, I knew. He looked at me like he had been waiting, like he knew I would come. I forced myself to sit, to listen to the conversation, to pretend. But I could feel his gaze on me, studying, waiting, testing my resolve. And the worst part? I wanted him to. At some point, my friend got a phone call and excused herself, leaving us alone. I exhaled slowly, gripping my coffee cup, keeping my eyes fixed on the table. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said. I laughed, but it was hollow. "I'm not afraid of you." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Then why won't you look at me?" I swallowed. "Because I know what you're doing." "And what am I doing?" I finally met his gaze. "Trying to break me down." His lips twitched. "And is it working?" I hated how easily he could read me. How the slightest shift in his voice, the way he looked at me, made me feel like my entire world was on the edge of something dangerous. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. I should have. But I didn't. The rest of the lunch was a blur. My friend returned, we ate, we laughed. I did my best to act like nothing was wrong, like I wasn't falling apart under the weight of what was happening between us. And then, just as I was about to leave, he followed me outside. I turned to say something, anything, but before I could, he moved closer, pressing me back against my car. The breath caught in my throat. "This is insane," I whispered. He brushed a strand of hair from my face, his fingers grazing my cheek. "Then stop me." I should have. I didn't. And then he kissed me. This time there was no hesitation. No careful test of boundaries. It was demanding, certain, knowing, and I fell into it before I could think, before I could stop myself. My hands fisted in his shirt, my body pressing against his without a second thought. The rush, the heat, the utter loss of control. It was intoxicating. And when I finally pulled away, breathless and shaken, he was smiling. "You keep telling yourself you don't want this," he murmured. "But you're lying." I had no response. Because I knew he was right. And I knew that this was only the beginning. I told myself it wouldn't happen again. That I had lost control for a moment, but I wasn't this woman. The kind who risked everything for something fleeting, something reckless. And yet, 2 days later, I found myself standing in front of a mirror, choosing lingerie with more intention than I should have. I stared at my reflection. My body still looked the same, yet I felt different. My skin was sensitive to the slightest touch, my breath shallower, my thoughts tangled. My hands trembled slightly as I fastened the lace bra, the fabric delicate against my skin. Why was I doing this? Because it was no longer about stopping myself. It was about when. I told my husband I had errands to run. Why? One of many I would soon have to tell. I texted him first. No hesitation. No pretense. "Me, where are you?" His response came immediately. Him, home alone. "Come find me." I should have waited. I should have let time soften the weight of what had happened between us. But I didn't. The drive felt longer than it was. My pulse pounded in my ears, my hands gripping the wheel too tightly. I wasn't nervous. I was starving. When I arrived, I didn't knock. The door was already slightly open. I stepped inside, closing it behind me, and there he was. Sitting back on the couch, watching me like he had been expecting me all along. Like he knew I couldn't resist. "You didn't even hesitate," he said, tilting his head. I set my purse down, exhaling slowly. "Did you think I would?" A slow smile. "No." We stood there for a moment, the space between us thick with unspoken things. Then he got up, walking toward me, slow and deliberate. "You know what I love about this?" I swallowed hard. "What?" "You're the one who came to me." His fingers brushed along the inside of my wrist, tracing the rapid pulse there. My breath hitched. This wasn't an accident anymore. This was a choice. My choice. And when he pulled me closer, tilting my chin up to meet his lips, I didn't hesitate. I wanted this. I needed it. And this time, there was no regret. Later, as I lay beside him, the weight of what I had done should have crashed down on me. But all I felt was a strange, intoxicating relief. For the first time in years, I felt alive. And that terrified me. Because I knew I wasn't going to stop. I should have felt guilt. By now, I should have been drowning in it, suffocating under the weight of my choices. But I wasn't. Instead, all I could think about was when I'd see him again. The affair was no longer something I fought against. It was something I welcomed, something I craved like a slow-burning addiction. Every stolen moment, every whispered word, every touch, I lived for it now. And that was dangerous. Because secrets never stay buried forever. I never thought I'd find myself in such a ridiculous situation. It started innocently enough. After a long day, I wanted something simple to take my mind off things, so I decided to make dessert. Cooking always helped me relax, kept my hands busy when my thoughts were spinning out of control. I placed fresh cherries on the counter, ripe, dark, bursting with juice. Slowly, I began to remove the pits, pressing my fingers against the fruit, feeling the stickiness of the sweet liquid trickling down my hands. It was almost hypnotic, the rhythm of it. I was so lost in the moment that I didn't hear him enter the kitchen. But I felt him. A presence behind me, the air shifting, the subtle heat of another body too close. His voice cut through the quiet, making me flinch. "You always make a mess when you cook?" The cherry slipped from my fingers, rolling across the table before coming to a stop near the edge. I turned, my heart stumbling in my chest. He was standing there, arms crossed, watching me with something unreadable in his expression. His gaze flicked to my hands where dark red juice stained my skin. For a second, neither of us spoke. The tension between us coiled tight, thicker, heavier than before. His jaw tensed slightly as if he wanted to say something but changed his mind. And then I saw it. The way he looked at me. Like he was seeing something he shouldn't. Something he couldn't ignore. It took me a second to realize how this must look from his perspective. The fruit, the mess, the way my breath had quickened. Heat rushed to my face. I scrambled to explain, my voice too fast, too defensive. I was just making dessert. He raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Then slowly, deliberately he smirked. Not a laugh. A knowing smirk. And then he simply turned and walked out, leaving me standing there, completely thrown. I exhaled sharply, staring at the cherries, my hands still sticky with juice. What the hell was that? How had something so normal, so simple become this? And more importantly, why did I feel like I had just lost a battle I didn't even know I was fighting? Things only got worse from there. It wasn't just stolen moments anymore. It wasn't just secrecy and whispered words in the dark. We were reckless now. Every second together was like stepping too close to the edge, and yet neither of us pulled back. I found myself watching my husband more closely, searching for any flicker of doubt in his eyes. Did he know? Could he tell? I told myself we were careful. That no one would suspect. I was wrong. But someone did. It was my friend who noticed first. She had always been perceptive, too quick to read between the lines. And lately she had started watching me differently, not in an obvious way but enough to make me nervous. One night, as we sat together with glasses of wine, she studied me for a long moment before finally speaking. "You've been different lately." I forced a smile. "What do you mean?" She swirled her wine, watching me over the rim of her glass. "I don't know. Distracted maybe. Like something's on your mind." I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. "Just life." She nodded slowly, but something in her eyes told me she didn't believe me. And then casually, almost as if she were testing me, she added, "My son mentioned you ran into him the other day. Said you seemed off." The words hit like a blow, but I forced myself not to react. "Did he?" I said lightly, taking a slow sip of my drink. She nodded. "Yeah. He said you seemed nervous." I let out a breathy laugh. "That's ridiculous." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. A warning. A quiet, unspoken threat. I realized then, I wasn't as careful as I thought. And worse. She was starting to put the pieces together. I should have stopped. Right then. Right there. I should have seen the warning in her eyes, the way she lingered just a second too long before taking another sip of her wine. But I didn't. Because by then it was already too late. The next few days passed in a blur of stolen glances, of whispered words, of moments so dangerously close to being caught that it sent a thrill racing down my spine. And then it happened. The moment that changed everything. I was at her house again. This time I had promised myself I would keep my distance. Be smarter. Be better. But the second I stepped inside and saw him, I knew it was impossible. Because he looked at me like he was waiting. Like he knew. Like he was daring me to do something about it. The house was loud, guests mingling, laughter spilling through the air. My friend was somewhere in the kitchen, busy with drinks, oblivious to what was unraveling just beyond her reach. And I was pressed against a hallway wall, his breath warm against my skin. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my pulse hammering. His lips ghosted over my ear. "You came here knowing I'd be here." My fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt before I could stop myself. "This is insane," I breathed. "You say that every time." And yet I wasn't pushing him away. Because I didn't want to. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't heard the footsteps. But we did. And when I turned my head, my stomach dropped. My friend, standing at the end of the hallway, watching us with an expression that sent ice flooding through my veins. I jerked back, my heart in my throat, panic crashing over me like a wave. But the damage was done. He knew. The next few seconds felt endless. I opened my mouth to say something, anything. But she just shook her head. And then, without a word, she turned and walked away. I should have gone after her. I should have begged, explained, lied. But I didn't. Because all I could feel was the weight of my choices finally crushing down on me. And the worst part? Even as my world fell apart around me, even as I lost my closest friend, even as I realized there was no fixing this, I still wanted him.